Well, it finally happened. I was Earth's delegate to the United Planets. Or more precisely, a candidate, though that isn't right either, since it was not my candidacy, but all humanity's, which the General Assembly was going to consider. Never in my life did I feel so nervous. My tongue was thick, my mouth dry, and when I walked out onto the red carpet spread from the astrobus, I couldn't tell whether it or my knees were gently buckling under me. Speeches would surely have to be given, but I was too choked with emotion to stammer out a single word, so that when I caught sight of a large, shiny machine with a chrome counter and little slots for coins, I hurriedly inserted one, placing the cup of my thermos underneath its spigot. This was the first interplanetary incident in the history of human diplomacy on the galactic level. Since what I had taken for a soft drink, vending machine turned out to be the deputy chairman of the Rohosh delegation in full regalia. By a great stroke of luck, the Roshis happened to be the ones who had offered to sponsor our candidacy at the meeting, though I didn't know this at the time, and when that high dignitary spat upon my boots, I took it as a bad sign, while in fact it was only the aromatic secretion of his salutation glands. All this I understood after swallowing an informational translational tablet handed me by some sympathetic up official. Immediately the jangling sounds around me changed in my ears to perfectly coherent words. The quadrangle of aluminum bowling pins at the end of the plush carpet became an honor guard. And the Roche that greeted me, till then looking more like a very large pretzel, seemed an old acquaintance, whose appearance was in no way unusual. But my nervousness remained. A small trundler pulled up, constructed especially for the conveyance of biped creatures such as myself. The Roche accompanying me squeezed in after me with difficulty and, taking a seat to the right, as well as to the left of me, said, "Honorable Earthling, I must inform you that a slight procedural complication has taken place. The actual head chairman of our delegation, the one most qualified to promote your candidacy, being a specialist Earthist, was unfortunately recalled to the capital last night, and I am supposed to replace him. You are familiar with the protocol?" "No, I haven't had the chance," I muttered, trying without much success to make myself comfortable in the chair of the trundler, which had not been completely adapted to the needs of the human body. The seat was more like a steep pit, practically 2 feet deep, and on the bumps my knees touched my forehead. "Never mind, we'll manage," said the Roach. His flowing robe, pressed into rectangular shapes that glittered metallically, and which I had mistaken earlier for a refreshment stand, hummed softly as he cleared his throat and continued. "Of course I am acquainted with the history of your people. Indeed, to be so informed is one of my duties, and truly what a magnificent thing it is, this humanity. Our delegation will move. Item number 83 on the agenda, that you be accepted as official members of the Assembly, with full rights and privileges accruing thereunto. You haven't by any chance lost your certification paper?" The roll of parchment in question, somewhat limp with sweat, was clutched in my right hand. "Good," he said. "So then, yes, I shall deliver a speech depicting your great achievements, achievements which entitle you to take your rightful place in the Astral Federation. This is, you understand, a kind of ancient formality. I mean, you don't anticipate any opposition, do you?" Well, no, I don't think," I mumbled. "Of course not. The very idea. So then, strictly a formality. Nonetheless, I will need certain information. Facts, you understand, details. Atomic energy, one may assume you already have at your disposal?" "Oh yes, yes," I eagerly assured him. "Marvelous. But wait. I have it right here. The head chairman left me his notes, but his handwriting, well, and for how long have you availed yourselves of this energy?" "Since the 6th of August, 1945. "Excellent. What was it? The first power plant?" "No," I replied, feeling myself blush. The first atomic bomb. It destroyed Hiroshima. Hiroshima? A meteor? Not a meteor. A city. A city, he said, uneasy. In that case, how to put it? He thought for a moment. No, it's best to say nothing, he decided. All right, fine, but I must have something to praise. Come now, think hard, we'll be there any minute. Ooh, space travel, I began. That is self-evident. Without space travel you wouldn't be here now, he explained, a little testily, I thought. To what do you devote the bulk of your national revenue? Try to recall any grand feat of engineering, architecture on the cosmic scale, gravitational solar launchers, well, he prompted. Yes, that is, work is underway, I said. Government funds are rather limited. Most of it goes into defense. Defense of what? The continents? Against meteors? Earthquakes? No, not that kind of defense. Armaments, armies. What is that? A hobby? Not a hobby. Internal conflicts, I muttered. This is no recommendation, he said with obvious distaste. Really, you didn't come flying here straight out of the cave. Your learned ones must have realized long ago that planetary cooperation is invariably more profitable than struggles for loot and supremacy. They did, but there are reasons of a historical nature, you see. We are getting nowhere, he said. I am here, after all, not to defend you, as if you were on trial, but to commend, applaud, speak highly of, enumerate your merits and your virtues. You understand? I understand. My tongue by now was as stiff as if someone had frozen it. The starched collar of my dress shirt choked me. Its front was all damp with the sweat that was pouring from me. I caught my roll of credentials on one of the medals and tore the outside sheet. The Roche, annoyed, contemptuous, yet at the same time detached, as though thinking of other things, suddenly said with an unexpected calm and mildness, "Ah, the artful diplomat." I shall speak instead of your culture, of its outstanding achievements. You do have a culture, he quickly added. We do indeed, a splendid culture, I assured him. That's good. Art? Oh yes, music, poetry, architecture. So then, architecture after all, he exclaimed. Wonderful, I must make a note of that. Explosives? How do you mean, explosives? Creative detonations controlled to regulate the climate, shift continents, riverbeds. You have that? So far only bombs, I said, then added in a hesitant whisper. But there are many different kinds. Napalm, phosphorus, and even with poison gas. That's not what I had in mind, he said coldly. Let us stick to the intellectual life. What do you believe in? This Roche who was supposed to recommend us was not, as I finally realized, a specialist in earthly affairs. The thought that our fate would shortly be decided by the appearance of a creature of such ignorance before the forum of the entire galaxy, well, it took my breath away. What rotten luck, I thought. They would have to go recall that head chairman, the Earthist. We believe in universal brotherhood, in the triumph of peace and concord over hatred and war. We consider that man should be the measure of all things. He placed a heavy claw on my knee. Why man? He said. Well, never mind. Still, your catalogue is negative. The absence of war, the absence of hatred. By all that's nebular. Have you no positive ideals? It was stifling hot. We believe in progress, in a better tomorrow, in the power of science. At last something, he cried. Science, yes, good. That I can use. And on which sciences do you spend the most? Physics, I replied. Research into atomic energy. Look, I tell you what. Say nothing. Let me do the talking. I'll handle this. Leave everything to me. And chin up, he said as the machine stopped in front of a building. My head was spinning. Things swam before my eyes. I was led down crystal corridors. Invisible barriers of some kind flew open with musical sighs. Then I was plunging down, then up, then down again. The Roche stood at my side, immense, silent, wrapped in folds of metal. Suddenly everything came to a halt. The glass balloon in front of me bulged and burst. I was standing at the bottom of the hall of the General Assembly. The amphitheater, spread out in funnel fashion, went swirling up in circular tiers of seats, immaculately white, dazzling. In the distance, the tiny silhouettes of the delegations were sprinkles of emerald, gold, and crimson along the spiraling ivory levels, strangely scintillating myriads it hurt to look upon. At first I was unable to distinguish eyes from metals, limbs from their artificial extensions. I only saw that they were moving rapidly, reaching across the snowy desks for sheaves of documents, black and shiny things, like tiles of anthracite, while directly opposite me, at a distance of some 50 or 60 feet, flanked by walls of electronic machines, the Secretary General sat atop a dais in the middle of a forest of microphones. Snatches of conversations floated in the air, conversations conducted in 1,000 languages at once. And these stellar dialects ranged from the lowest basses to notes as shrill as the chirping of birds. With the feeling that the floor might open up beneath me any minute, I pulled my tuxedo straight. A sound rang out, reverberating endlessly. It was the Secretary General setting in motion a machine that swung a mallet at a slab of solid gold. The vibrations made my ears throb. The Roche, towering above me, pointed to my place as the voice of the Secretary General boomed from unseen loudspeakers. But before sitting down by the rectangular sign that bore the name of my native planet, I scanned the curving rows of seats, higher and higher, trying to find at least one kindred soul, at least one creature of humanoid appearance, in vain. Enormous shapes, lush, tuber-like, coils of aspic, currant jelly, fleshy stalks, pedunculations propped against the desks, faces the color of well-seasoned meat pies, or gleaming like rice fritters, knots, pads, mandibles, pseudopodia holding the fates of stars both far and near. All passed before me, nor was there anything monstrous about them. I experienced no revulsion, contrary to the suppositions expressed so often back on Earth. As though I were not dealing here with cosmic horrors, but with beings that had emerged from beneath the chisel of some abstractionist sculptor, or perhaps a gastronomic visionary. Item number 82, hissed the Roche in my ear, and took his seat. I did the same. Picking up the headphones that lay on the desk, I listened in. The appliances, which, pursuant to the treaty ratified by this esteemed assembly, were, in full accordance with the terms specified in that treaty, delivered by the Altair Commonwealth to the Sexpartite Alliance of Fomalhaut, have displayed, as was confirmed by the report of the ad hoc subcommittee of the UP, certain properties which cannot be accounted for by minor deviations from the technological prescription. Granted, as the Altair Commonwealth correctly notes, the radiation sifters and planetary regulators it manufactured were indeed supposed to possess the ability to reproduce, guaranteeing thereby the creation of machine progeny, which was duly provided for in the contract drawn up between both the esteemed parties involved. Nevertheless, that potentiality should have taken the form, in compliance with the engineering code of ethics that binds all members of our federation, of individual budding. and not resulted from the endowment of the above-mentioned mechanisms with programs of opposing signs, which, unfortunately, did in fact take place. This programmed polarity led to the creation, within the main energy compounds of formality, of prurient tensions, and, as a consequence of these, scenes that were not only offensive to public morality, but which entailed serious material losses for the plaintiff party as well. The delivered units, instead of attending to the work they had been designed to perform, devoted most of their shifts to partner selection, whereby their constant running about with plugs for the purpose of recreational coupling led to violations of the Penundrian statute and, ultimately, mechanical-graphic overcrowding, for both of which regrettable phenomena the defendant party is to blame. And so we hereby declare the debt to Altair null and void. I put down the phones with a splitting headache. To hell with these machines offending the public morality, Altair, formality, and all the rest of it. I had had enough of the up, and wasn't even a member yet. I felt ill. Why did I ever listen to Professor Tarantoga? What use to me was this awful honor that obliged me to blush for the sins of others? Instead, I should have. An invisible current ran through me, for there on the enormous board flashed the digits 83, and I felt a vigorous jab. It was my Roche who, jumping to his claws or perhaps feelers, pulled me after him. The sun lamps floating beneath the ceiling of the hall directed upon us a blazing flood of azure light. Bathed on all sides by beams of radiance which seemed to shine right through me, and numbly clutching my thoroughly limp roll of certification papers, I heard the powerful bass of the Roche booming at my side, voluble and unconstrained, filling the entire amphitheater, yet the content of his speech reached me only in snatches, like sea foam during a storm, spraying the one who dares lean out over the pier. This marvelous Arth, he couldn't even pronounce the name of my native planet properly. This noble humanity, and here its distinguished representative, elegant, amiable mammals, atomic energy, released with consummate skill in the foothills of their mountains. A youthful, buoyant culture, full of feeling, a deep faith in Jurgendery, though not devoid of ambifribus. Evidently he was confusing us with someone else, devoted to the cause of interstellar solidarity, in the hopes that their admittance into this august body, bringing to an end the embryonic phase of their social development. Though alone and isolated on their galactic periphery, plucky, independent, surely deserving. So far, in spite of everything, it's going well, flashed the thought. He's praising us not badly either. But wait, what's this? True, they are paired. Their rigid underpinning. But one must understand, in this esteemed assembly exceptions to the rule have the right to be represented too. There is no shame in abnormality. The difficult conditions that shape them. Aqueousness, even when saline, need not be an obstacle. With our assistance in the future they can rid themselves of this ugh, of this unfortunate appearance, which the esteemed assembly with its customary generosity will be willing, I trust, to disregard. And so on behalf of the Roche delegation and the Sidereal Union of Betelgeuse, I hereby move that humanity from the planet Orith be recognized as a member of the United Planets, and that is all. A mighty roar broke out, interspersed with strange whistlings, but no applause, nor could there have been any, in the absence of hands. This din and racket abruptly subsided at the sound of a gong, and the voice of the Secretary-General could be heard. Do any of the esteemed delegations intend to speak to the motion now under consideration, namely, the recognition of humanity from the planet Arith? The radiant Roche, evidently extremely pleased with himself, dragged me back to my seat. I sat down, mumbling some incoherent words of appreciation for his services, when two pale green rays shot out simultaneously from different parts of the amphitheater. "The representative from Thuban has the floor," said the Secretary General. Something rose to speak. "Esteemed Council," came the far yet piercing voice, not unlike the sound of sheet metal being cut, but the timbre quickly ceased to occupy my attention. "We have just heard, from the mouthparts of Pulpiter Vortex, a warm recommendation for the race of a distant planet, till now unknown to those assembled here. I should like to express my keen disappointment that the unexpected absence at today's session of Sulpiter Extrever has deprived us of the opportunity to acquaint ourselves more particularly with the history, the manners, and the nature of that race, whose presence in the all Rochdom so eagerly desires. Now I am no specialist in the field of cosmic teratology, however I would like, to the extent of my modest abilities, to supplement what we have just had the pleasure of hearing. First of all, in passing only, parenthetically as it were, I will point out that the native planet of humanity is called not Orith, Arith or Arth, as was said, not out of ignorance of course, but purely, as I am quite convinced, in the heat of the oratorical moment, by my worthy colleague the preceding speaker. An insignificant detail, to be sure. However, the other term, humanity, which I made use of, is taken from the language of the race of Earth, the correct name, incidentally, for that obscure little planet, while our sciences designate the Earthlings somewhat differently. I trust it shall not unduly weary this esteemed assembly if I take the liberty of giving the full name and classification of the species whose membership in the we are considering, quoting for that purpose from an excellent work of specialists, namely, the galactical teratology of Gramplus and Gazemes. The representative from Thuban opened the enormous volume on his desk to the place indicated by a bookmark, and read, "In accordance with the accepted systems of taxonomy and nomenclature, all anomalous forms found in our galaxy are contained within the phylum Aberrantia, deviates, freaks, which is divided into the subphyla Debilitales, boobs, and Antisapientineos, screeds. To the latter subphylum belong the classes Canaliacea, Thuglis, and Necroludentia, corpusculovers. Among the corpusculovers we distinguish, in turn, the orders Patricidiaceae, father-beaters, Matriphagidae, mother-aters, and Lasciviaceae, abominites, or scumberbutts. The abominites, highly degenerate forms, we divide into the Cretininae, clenchpoops, viz., Cadaverium mordens, or the Chucarcas adelpate, and Horissimi, howlmouths, with the classic example of the out-chested back-shouldered dullard, Idiontus erectus xemsi. A few of the howlmouths have actually been known to create their own pseudocultures. Among these are such species as Anopheles belligerens, the bungfon tuff, which calls itself Genius Pulcherimus mundanus, or that most curious specimen, possessing an entirely bald body, and observed by Gramplus in the darkest corner of our galaxy, Monstrata racem, the stinking mimi, which has given itself the name of Homo sapiens. A clamor went up in the hall. The Secretary General set in motion his machine with the mallet. "Stiff upper lip," hissed the Roche. I couldn't see him, what with the glare from the sun lamps, or perhaps it was the sweat getting into my eyes. A ray of hope flickered within me, for someone was demanding to be heard on a point of order. Presenting himself to the assembly as a member of the Aquarius delegation, who was also an astrozoologist, he began to take issue with the Thubanian, but alas, only on the grounds that, as a disciple of the school of Professor Hagranops, he considered the classification put forward to be incomplete. For he distinguished, after his mentor, the separate order Degeneratores, to which belonged the Faujaws, Upgluts, Necrovores, and Stifflickers. The application of the term monstratoratus to man, he also felt, was incorrect. Instead, one should follow the nomenclature of the Aquarian school, employing the more consistent term of bug-eyed bogus, artefactum abhorrens. After a brief exchange of remarks, the Thubanian resumed his speech. The honorable representative of Rohkia, urging upon us the candidacy of this so-called man the wise, or, to be more precise, this bug-eyed Mimi, a typical example of a corpse lover, failed to mention, in his recommendation, inward albumen, apparently thinking it indecent, and indeed the word does evoke associations, which propriety forbids me to elaborate on here. Nor in the bestowing upon oneself, when one happens to be a corpse-loathing howler, the title of sapient human. This is but a weakness, quite understandable if not forgivable, dictated by one's amour propre. No, the problem lies not here, esteemed counsel. My attention began to wander, blur, go blank. I was catching only snatches. And even carnivorism is no one's fault, if it results in the course of natural evolution. Yet the differences separating so-called man from his animal relatives are practically non-existent. Just as an individual who is higher may not claim that this gives him the right to devour those who are lower, so one endowed with a somewhat higher intelligence may neither devour nor murder those of lower mentality. And if he absolutely must do this, shouts of, "He mustn't. Let him eat spinach." If, I say, he must, by reason of some tragic hereditary affliction, he should at least consume the bloodied victims with dismay. In secret, in his lair and the darkest recesses of the cave, torn by feelings of remorse, anguish, and the hope that he will be able, someday, to free himself from that burden of unremitting murder. But such, alas, is not the behavior of our stinking Mimi. It desecrates the mortal remains, chopping, stewing, skewering. It toys with them, only afterwards to ingest them in public feeding places, in the presence of cavorting naked females of its species, which serves to whet its appetite for the dead. The necessity of changing this stage of affairs, that cries out to the entire galaxy for revenge, never even enters its colloidal head. On the contrary, it has provided itself with higher justifications, which, residing somewhere between the stomach, that crypt of innumerable victims, and eternity, entitle it to continue murdering with a clear conscience. So much, then, not to take up the time of this esteemed assembly, for the activities and habits of man the wise. Among its ancestors, there was one that seemed to promise much. I speak of the species Homo neanderthalensis. He deserves our attention. Similar in appearance to modern man, he possessed a brain case of greater capacity, hence a larger brain, or intellect. A gatherer of mushrooms, inclined to meditation, a true lover of the arts, gentle, phlegmatic. There is no doubt but that he would have made a strong candidate for membership in our esteemed organization. Unfortunately, he no longer is among the living. Would perhaps the delegate from Earth, whom we have the honor here to entertain, care to tell us what became of the ever-so-civilized and likable Neanderthal? I see he does not, so I must speak for him. The Neanderthal was exterminated root and branch, wiped off the face of the earth, by our self-same Homo sapiens. And as if the foul deed of fratricide was not enough, Earth scholars then began to blacken the name of the annihilated victim, ascribing to themselves, and not to it, their cerebral superior, the higher intelligence. Today we have among us, here in this venerable hall, within these lofty walls, a representative of the corpse-eaters, one who is resourceful in the pursuit of lethal pleasures, a cunning architect of wholesale slaughter, and whose physical appearance inspires in us both ridicule and horror, a horror we are scarcely able to overcome. Today we see, there on that hitherto white, unsullied seat, a creature that lacks even the courage of a consistent criminal, for it ever seeks to dress its body-strewn career with the splendor of false names, names whose true and terrible meaning may be deciphered by any objective student of interstellar civilization. Yes, esteemed counsel. In point of fact, I got only fragments from this 2-hour harangue, but they were more than enough. The Thubanian created a picture of monsters wallowing in a sea of blood, and he did this without haste, methodically opening still other learned books, records, annals, chronicles, all placed in preparation on his desk, and took to hurling the materials to the floor when he was done with them, as if in a sudden fit of disgust, as if the very pages that described us had become caked with the victim's blood. Then he turned to our recorded history. He told of the massacres, pogroms, wars, crusades, genocides, and using slides and full-scale charts, showed the technologies of crime, instruments of torture, ancient and medieval. When he started in on the present day, 16 assistants had to wheel in carts that groaned beneath stacks of additional documentation. Other assistants, or rather paramedicals, meanwhile administered, from tiny helicopters, first aid to the hundreds of listeners who had grown weak during the lecture, but me they ignored, in the naive belief, I suppose, that the stream of gory details of Earthel's culture. But actually about halfway through that presentation I began, like one on the brink of madness, to fear my very self, as if, thrown in among these phantasmagorical outlandish beings that surrounded me on every side, I were the only monster. Then, just as it seemed that this horrible list of accusations would never end, the words were uttered. And now let the esteemed assembly proceed to vote upon the motion of the Roche delegation. The hall fell into a deathly silence, till something stirred right beside me. It was my Roche rising in the attempt, a desperate attempt, to refute at least a few of the charges made. But he put his foot in it completely when he tried to assure the assembly that mankind felt the deepest respect for the Neanderthals, its venerable ancestors, who had died out entirely by themselves. The Thubanian, however, demolished my defender on the spot with a single well-aimed question, put directly to me. On Earth, did calling someone a Neanderthal pass for a compliment, or was it instead a term of abuse? Well, it was all over now, I thought. Every hope was lost, and I would be limping home like a dog sent back to its kennel for having been caught with a little bird, half smothered in its jaws. But then, in the hum and buzz of the hall, the Secretary General leaned over to the microphone and said, "The chair recognizes the representative from the Iridian delegation." The Iridian was short, silvery gray and plump, like a puff of smoke caught in the slanting rays of the winter sun. "I would like to ask," he said, "who will be paying the Earthlings' enrollment fee? They themselves? It's a considerable sum. 1 billion tons of platinum. Not every applicant has that kind of metal." An angry murmur filled the amphitheater. "Your question will be appropriate only when the motion of the Roche delegation has been taken to a vote and passed," said the Secretary General after a moment's hesitation. "With the permission of your galactitude," returned the Iridian, "I happen to be of a somewhat different opinion, and therefore wish to support the question I just raised with a few observations, which I think you shall find most relevant. I have here, to begin with, a work of that renowned consultant planetologist, Hyperdoctor Frogras, and I quote from it as follows. Planets on which life cannot spontaneously originate have these distinguishing features. A. Radical climatic changes in rapidly alternating sequences, i.e., the so-called cycle spring, summer, autumn, winter, or those even more cataclysmic, occurring at great intervals, ice ages. B. The presence of large natural satellites. Their tidal influences also are inimical to life. C. Frequently appearing maculations on the surface of the central or mother star, as these are a source of deleterious radiation. D. The preponderance in area of seas over continents. E. Persistent glaciation in the polar regions. F. The atmospheric precipitation of water in its solid or liquid state. As one can plainly see. "Point of order," cried my Roche, jumping up as if fired with some new hope. "I ask whether the delegation from Iridia will vote in favor of the motion, or against it." "In favor of the motion, but with an amendment we shall shortly propose to this esteemed assembly," the Iridian replied, then went on. "Revered Council, at the 918th session of the General Assembly, in this very hall, we considered the application for membership of a race of bungbrain abominoids, who presented themselves to us as supremius everlasters, while in actual fact their forms were so impermanent that during the above-mentioned session of the Assembly the composition of this abominate delegation changed 15 times, though the session itself lasted no more than 8. These wretched creatures, when the time arrived to submit the curriculum vitae of their race, became hopelessly entangled in contradictions, solemnly assuring the esteemed assembly, though, mind you, without a shred of evidence, that they had been created by a certain supreme mover in his own perfect image, owing to which circumstance they were, among other things, spiritually immortal. Then when it came to light that their planet fit exactly the bionegative conditions of Hyperdoctor Frogress, the Joint Plenary Assembly appointed a special investigative subcommittee, and that body confirmed that the race of screeweeds under suspicion had arisen not as a result of any prank of nature, but instead due to a regrettable incident brought about by third parties. "What's he saying? Hush! Not true! Kindly remove that claw, you deviate," went the commotion in the hall, growing by the minute. "The findings of the investigative subcommittee," continued the Iridian, "led to the passage at the next session of the UP of an amendment to Article 2 of the United Planets Charter, which amendment reads as follows." Here he unrolled a lengthy parchment and cleared his throat. "A categorical ban is hereby imposed on the engagement in any life-initiating activities on all planets of the Frogress type A, B, C, D, or E. Also the authorities in charge of research expeditions, as well as commanders of ships that land upon such globes, are as of now instructed to see to, and therefore held fully responsible for, the strict observance of the aforesaid ban. This includes not only deliberate life-engendering practices, like the sowing of algae, bacteria, and so forth, but also the unintentional induction of bioevolution, whether through negligence or in absent-mindedness. Such contraceptive prophylaxis is dictated by the best intentions and knowledge of the UP, and particularly in cognizance of the following facts. In the first place, the natural hostility of an environment which one has externally inoculated with microorganisms gives rise, in the course of their subsequent evolution, to deviations and deformities of a sort never encountered within the domain of natural biogenesis. Secondly, these adverse circumstances produce species which are not only defective physiologically, but burdened as well with the severest forms of psychic abnormality. And if under such conditions there should develop beings possessing some small degree of intelligence, and this does on occasion happen, their existence will be filled with great mental suffering. For, upon attaining the first stage of consciousness, they immediately begin to search their surroundings for the cause of their own origin, and, unable to find it there, turn in confusion and despair to blind, delusive faiths. In particular, since the normal course of evolutionary processes in the universe is unknown to them, they take their physical shape, however hideous it may be, as well as their way, such as it is, of thinking, for ordinary phenomena, entirely typical of those manifested throughout the macrocosm. And therefore, out of deep concern for the well-being and dignity of life in general, and of sentient beings in particular, the General Assembly of the UP resolves and decrees that whosoever violates this contraceptive article of the UP Charter, effective immediately, shall be subject to sanctions and penalties pursuant to the terms of the corresponding paragraphs of the Code of Interplanetary Law. The Iridian, putting aside the up-charter, lifted a massive volume of the code, which nimble assistants placed in his tentacles, and opening that monumental tome to the right page, read in a ringing voice. Volume 2 of the Interplanetary Penal Code, Section 80, entitled On Planetary Incontinence. Paragraph 212. The impregnating of a planet naturally barren is punishable by no less than 100, no more than 1,500 years of full ostracism, irrespective of any civil liability for the moral and material losses suffered by the victims. Paragraph 213. The infraction of paragraph 212, aggravated by the conspicuous presence of malicious intent, as evidenced by manipulations of a wanton nature and with premeditation, whose purpose is the evolution of life forms singularly disfigured, to inspire universal fear or universal revulsion, is punishable by ostracism and distillation of up to 1,500 years. Paragraph 214. The impregnating of a barren planet as a result of carelessness, oversight, or through the slipshod application of appropriate contraceptive measures is punishable by ostracism of up to 400 years. If the act is committed in relative ignorance or otherwise reduced awareness of its consequences, the sentence may be reduced to 100 years. I make no mention, added the Iridian, of the penalties for interfering with an evolutionary process in statu nascendi, as that does not concern us here. However, I would like to point out that the Code does provide for the material liability of the perpetrators with respect to the victims of their planetary incontinence. I will not quote the relevant sections of the Civil Code, for fear of altogether exhausting the patience of the members of this assembly. I note only that in the catalogue of spheres held to be definitively barren by Hyperdoctor Frogrus, no less than by the United Planets Charter and Interplanetary Penal Code, we find on page 2618, 8th line from the bottom, the following heavenly bodies: Ea, Ijon, Sharn, Earth. My mouth fell open. The certification papers slipped from my hand. It grew dark before my eyes. "Pay attention!" they were shouting in the hall. "Hear, hear! Who does he mean? Down with! Long live! Long live!" As for me, to the degree that it was possible, I tried crawling under the desk. "Esteemed Council," thundered the representative from Iridia, hurling the heavy volumes of the Interplanetary Code to the floor of the amphitheater. This must have been a favorite oratorical device in the up. "We can never hear enough of matters that bring dishonor to those who would violate the United Planets Charter. We can never brand enough those irresponsible elements who would beget life in conditions entirely unsuited for it. No, here we are, approached by creatures that have no inkling of the true odiousness of their existence, nor any knowledge of its cause. Now here they come knocking at the venerable door of this worthy assembly, and what then, pray, are we to tell them? All these abominoids, howlmouths, freak-snouts, clench-poops, corpse-lovers, mother-eaters, and addlepates, wringing their alleged hands and falling to their alleged knees, when they learn that in reality they belong to the subphylum Artefacta, and that their supreme and perfect creator was some ship's cook who once poured out upon the rocks of a dead planet a bucket of fermented slops, for his own amusement, imparting to that wretched source of life properties which later would make it the laughingstock of an entire galaxy. And how, pray, will these poor devils defend themselves when some future Cato throws up to them the shameful lever-auditory configuration, yes, the left-handedness, of their amino acids? The hall was all a-boil. In vain did the machine repeatedly swing its mallet. They were howling on every side. For shame! Down with Quarantine M! Who is he talking about? Look at the Earthling dissolve. The me is leaking all over." I was indeed sweating like a pig. The Iridian, raising his stentorian voice above the general roar, cried, "I shall now put a few final questions to the honorable delegation from Rohkia. Is it not true that many years ago there landed on the then-dead planet of Earth a ship carrying your flag, and that, due to a refrigerator malfunction, a portion of its perishables had gone bad? Is it not true that on this ship there were 2 space hands, afterwards stricken from all the registers for unconscionable double-dealing with duckweed liverworts, and that this pair of arrant knaves, these Milky Way ne'er-do-wells, were named Gord and Laud? Is it not true that Gord and Laud decided in their drunkenness not to content themselves with the usual pollution of a defenseless, uninhabited planet, that their notion was to set off, in a manner vicious and vile, a biological evolution, the likes of which the world had never seen before? Is it not true that both these roches, with malice aforethought, malice of the greatest volume and intensity, devised a way to make of Earth, on a truly galactic scale, a breeding ground for freaks, a cosmic sideshow, a panopticum, an exhibit of grisly prodigies and curios, a display whose living specimens would one day become the butt of jokes told even in the outermost nebula? Is it not true that, bereft of all sense of decency and ethical restraints, both these miscreants then emptied on the rocks of lifeless Earth 6 barrels of gelatinous glue, rancid, plus 2 cans of albuminous paste, spoiled, and that to this ooze they added some curdled ribose, pentose, and levulose. And as though that filth were not enough, they poured upon it 3 large jugs of a mildewed solution of amino acids, then stirred the seething swill with a coal shovel twisted to the left, and also used a poker, likewise bent in the same direction, as a consequence of which the proteins of all future organisms on Earth were left-handed. And finally, is it not true that Laud, suffering at the time from a runny nose and, moreover, egged on by Gord, who was reeling from an excessive intake of intoxicants, did willfully and knowingly sneeze into that protoplasmal matter, and, having infected it thereby with the most virulent viruses, guffawed that he had thus breathed the fucking breath of life into those miserable And is it not true that this leftwardness and this virulence were thereafter transmitted and handed down from organism to organism, and now afflict with their continuing presence the innocent representatives of the race artefactum abhorrens, who gave themselves the name of Homo sapiens purely out of simple-minded ignorance? And therefore, is it not true that the Roshis must not only pay the Earthlings' initiation fee, to the tune of 1 billion tons of platinum, but also compensate the unfortunate victims of their planetary incontinence, in the form of cosmic alimony? With these words, pandemonium broke loose in the amphitheater. I cowered. Flying through the air in every direction came portfolios, volumes of the Interplanetary Penal Code, and even material evidence, objects such as badly rust-eaten jugs, barrels, pokers, though Lord knows how they got there. Perhaps the clever Iridians, having some score to settle with the Roches, had been conducting archaeological research on Earth since time immemorial, collecting the incriminating evidence, which was all carefully stored on board their flying saucers. But I found it difficult to ponder such a point, for everything was heaving around me, tentacles and claws flashed past, and my Roche, extremely agitated, leaped up from his seat screaming something, but it was lost in the general bedlam, while I continued to sit, as it were, in the eye of the storm, and the last thought that pounded in my brain was the question of that sneeze with premeditation which had brought us into the world. The next thing I knew, someone seized me by the hair, painfully, till I groaned. It was the Roche, trying to demonstrate how solidly I'd been fashioned by Earth's evolution, and how little I deserved being called a paltry sort of creature, stuck together, and flimsily at that, out of rotten bits of refuse, and he walloped me over the head again and again with his enormous heavy claw. I felt the life slowly going out of me. My struggling grew weaker. I couldn't breathe. I gave a few last kicks in agony, and collapsed on my pillow. Half conscious, I jumped up immediately, sat on the bed, feeling my neck, head, chest, to make sure that all that I had undergone was but the product of an awful dream. I heaved a sigh of relief, but then later, some slight doubts began to trouble me. I told myself, for God's sake, it's only a dream? Somehow that didn't help. Finally, to dispel these gloomy thoughts, I went to see my aunt on the moon. But an 8-minute ride on a loonibus that stops right outside my house. No, I can hardly call this the 8th stellar voyage. More worthy of that title, surely would be the journey taken in my sleep, in which I suffered so for all humanity.